Thanks for joining us. I'm WTOP Capitol Hill correspondent Mitchell Miller, and this is The Road to Responsible AI, sponsored by Leidos on WTOP.com. And we're pleased to be joined by Congressman Jay Obernolte, who represents California's 23rd District and is the chairman of the House Task Force on Artificial Intelligence. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's an honor to be here.
Before we get into the details of all this, in terms of legislation, I wanted to just get your view, since you've been involved with this for so long, of artificial intelligence and some of its possibilities.
Well, I think that it's pretty clear artificial intelligence is going to change the world. However, artificial intelligence is not new. It's something that mankind has been studying for the last 40 years. And it seems a very strange symmetry in my life that I find myself chairing the Artificial Intelligence Task Force in the House, because little known fact about me is that my ambition in life when I was in high school was to be a researcher in AI. So I went to Caltech, got a degree in computer engineering. I was working on my doctorate in AI at UCLA, doing some of the very early research on natural language processing and computer vision when my side hustle at the time, which was writing video game software, took off. And that deflected me out of a career in academia into a career in business. And then ultimately I got into politics and found myself in Congress. So it seems a very strange turn of events for me to be leading the House effort on AI. But I had a group of 24 very talented and dedicated House members, and we are tasked with coming up with a federal regulatory framework for AI. So our work product will be a report delivered by the end of the year that will set out the work that we've been doing. We've had 15 different hearings throughout the year on various AI topics, and I am cautiously optimistic that our report will be the furthest thinking document on AI that's been produced by the legislative branch so far.
And as we get into that, if you could also talk to us a little bit about, a lot of people are not that familiar with AI, about the call for transparency, and a lot of people are just uncertain about things. Some people don't know if AI can control itself, essentially. And I wonder if you could address some of those concerns that people in the general public have raised.
Sure. Well, I think that's a very important question because unlike most topics that Congress legislates on, AI has been informed or misinformed by 50 years of science fiction and pop culture. So if you ask the average American, what are the chief dangers of AI? What is the maximum potential downside? You'll get an answer out of a Terminator movie where an army of evil robots rises up to take over the world with, their red laser eyes. But when we think about the hazards of AI, we come up with a completely different set of risk factors. I mean, no less consequential or even existential, but things like the potential spread of mis- and disinformation, national security implications, the potential for the malicious use of AI to pierce through digital data privacy, the use of AI to conduct cyber fraud. All of these things put together are potentially just as existential a threat as an army of evil robots. So our job as a task force is to go through that list of threats. We call it the parade of horribles, and suss out what is government's responsibility to guard against the public, guard the public against those threats, and then to recommend a path for carrying out that action.
Yeah, and I understand that you want to come up with essentially a regulatory framework related to what you just talked about, which is obviously a very complicated task given all the directions that AI goes into.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a wide disparity of opinion in the international community as to the best way to regulate AI. For example, last year, the European Union passed a 3,000-page bill called the AI Act that creates almost universal licensing requirement for anything but the lowest risk usage of AI and spins up a brand new Europe-wide bureaucracy for dealing with the regulation of AI. We, however, in the task force are recommending a very different path. We call it the hub and spoke approach. We believe in sectoral regulation. A lot of people think that AI is largely unregulated right now in the United States and that we are way behind other governments in regulating it. But that is actually untrue. Our sectoral regulators are already having to deal with the regulation of AI within their own sectoral spaces. I'll give you an example. The Food and Drug Administration has already processed over 1,000 applications for the use of AI in medical devices. Now think about that for a minute. There's If you categorize the risk of AI, the risk is highly contextual. So something that is unacceptably risky in one usage context would be completely benign in another one. So it very much matters what you're using the AI to do. You can't come up with a risk context for a usage more consequential than a medical device that's being used to make clinical decisions for healthcare or being implanted in someone's body. And yet the FDA is already having to navigate this space. So the question here is it easier to teach the FDA what it might not already know about AI, or is it easier to teach a brand new bureaucracy everything that the FDA has learned over the last 50 years about ensuring patient safety? And that's just one sector. I mean, we've got other sectoral regulators like NHTSA, who's having to deal with AI and autonomously piloted cars. The FAA is having to deal with AI in avionics software, and the list goes on and on and on. So we believe that we need to empower our sectoral regulators to regulate the use of AI within their sectoral spaces. And that's not to minimize the effort required. We're going to have a deep pool of technical talent and resources. We're going to have testing and evaluation standards and methodologies. We're going to have international cooperation and harmonization of standards and the detection of the proliferation of potentially malicious AI. So all of that is going to need to be done, but we are well on our way to accomplishing that already.
And I talked to some of the other panelists in connection with those issues related to federal agencies. And one of the things that was mentioned that there needs to be real trust between lawmakers developing this legislation and the agencies themselves.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things that's been an unintended beneficial consequence of the Artificial Intelligence Task Force in the House is that we have now produced a nucleus of 24 members who are highly engaged and educated on this issue. And I think that's very important because the trust that you're talking about can only come about through shared comprehension of the subject matter. And I think that that's one of the things that's been lacking in coordination between agencies and Congress in AI regulation in the past. So I think this is a really good start.
Related to that, I was speaking with Virginia Congressman Don Beyer, who is also a member of the panel, and he mentioned going back to the EU document, this massive document with regulation, that he was indicating that he would prefer a soft touch, quote unquote, related to regulation, that it cannot just be one huge onerous thing. And I know that you have said in the past that you don't want to just put basically a big book out of all these proposed regulations and then have that be the last thing, because it's evolving all the time.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And I think that Don is absolutely right when he fears overregulation. One of the things that's a little appreciated fact about federal regulation is that it almost always has the consequence of empowering large companies and disadvantaging small companies and entrepreneurialism, because the more complicated you make the regulatory landscape, the more legal resource that a company would need to deal with that. And that favors, the Googles and the Apples, not to pick on them, of the world that have office buildings full of lawyers over two guys trying to start the next Google in a garage somewhere. So I completely agree with Congressman Beyer about that. And I also think it's important to point out to people that you can't just regulate for the sake of regulating. You can't react to people's fear by saying, okay, here, we're going to create a bunch of new requirements and a big bureaucracy. You are now safe. You're welcome, right? That's not going to benefit the American public. Instead, I think that we need to honor the tradition that we have in this country of regulating outcomes and not tools. And what I mean by that is we don't care, for example, what tool you use to steal someone's money through cyber fraud. I mean, you could use a conventional phishing scam for that, right? Like as many people do right now, or you could use AI to do that. It's already illegal to do that. It doesn't matter if you use AI or some other tool. AI is a powerful tool, but it is merely a tool. And we don't regulate tools, we regulate outcomes. And I think that's a really important point to make, because you were talking about transparency a minute ago. And there's been a lot of fear because of the opacity of the way that AI algorithms work. And that gives people some deep distrust of artificial intelligence and some fears about the way that it impacts society. And a good catalyst for this was a few years ago when an algorithm was developed for the automated screening of resumes, right? We would now recognize that as a very risky use context, because it's what we would call a highly consequential decision, not something that you would entrust to an algorithm unless you know exactly what it's doing. But these were early days, and the algorithm was tested and found to exhibit some really troubling racial biases. And it turns out the racial biases were baked into the training data that was used to train the AI algorithm. So it was great that this was discovered. It was good that it was unintentional, but it was good that we learned a lot about the way that these biases creep into algorithms through the data used to train them. But none of that should distract from the fact that discriminating in employment decisions on the base of race is already illegal. It doesn't matter if you use an AI screening algorithm to do it or something else. So even if this algorithm was deployed, the moment that bias was demonstrated and discovered, it would be illegal to use it. So I mean, I think that should give some people some comfort that we have a framework in place to deal with this. And yes, it's going to require some tweaking to make sure that we encompass all the nuances of AI as we do it. But I think that's the approach that we need to take.
There's another interesting thing, and since we're in the middle of the political season. Recently, there was a hearing I know that you were involved in connection with trying to figure out how to regulate AI in connection with political advertising. And I know that there was kind of a back and forth with you and the FEC and the FCC. That some people just say, "Oh, well, you just need to call it out when it's there." But as you pointed out in that hearing, it's a lot more complicated than that.
It is absolutely, because we can all agree that intentionally misleading someone with artificial intelligence, for example, creating something we would call a deep fake, something that looks and seems to a human like something that's authentic when it's really not, and to put words in, for example, a politician's mouth that they didn't actually say, as has been done recently. We could all agree as a society that that's a bad thing and that shouldn't be allowed. But it's where the rubber hits the road that matters, which is how do you articulate that in legislation? Because we are also a country who believes deeply in the principle of free speech. And we have accepted the fact that parody is part of free speech. So, for example, if a political opponent were to use generative AI to create an image of Darth Vader with his arm around me and publicize that, right? They would argue that that is parody, right? And that it's also free speech, and it's protected because Darth Vader is a powerful symbol of evil, and in having his arm around me, they're conveying the fact, their belief that I am also evil, right? And they have a right to do that. The question is, would a reasonable person believe that Darth Vader is really in that picture with me? And I think that's what gets at the crux of the argument. I would hope that in the case of Darth Vader, the answer is no. But in the case of someone who's alive, who's been superimposed on an image, the answer might be yes. And so it's very difficult to navigate, but I believe that we are well on our way to getting our arms around that problem. And that's actually just a corner of the whole problem of the use of intellectual property in AI that we're having to deal with. That's if when our report comes out here in a couple of months out of the task force, one of the most voluminous sections is the one on intellectual property, because there are a lot of very thorny IP issues that we're going to have to solve with respect to AI. And this is just one of them.
And related to your report, when it comes out, are you going to be recommending some of these bills? I know that you have reviewed many bills in connection with AI. Is that going to be part of the report?
Yes, and in fact, we already have taken as a task force a position on a number of different bills. One of the reasons we're doing this, I mean, to be clear, the report, one of the pillars of the report is embrace of the concept of incrementalism. And you talked about it a few minutes ago. AI is such a technologically diverse field. It is so fast moving. It is absolutely impossible to pass one piece of regulation today, this year, and call it good. We're done. Everyone's protected. We're moving on. AI is going to change. I mean, just in the last year, we've seen the advent of generative AI. The year before that, it was the advent of large language models. Next year, I don't doubt there's going to be something else. So this is not the work of months or even a year. This is the months of years and years, the work of years and years in passing this legislation. But we think that there are quite a few bills out there that will form a good start. And so, for example, we passed 9 AI-related bills out of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee 3 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, we had another hearing. We passed another 3 bills, and other policy committees are doing similar work. So I am hopeful that we will get some floor time later this year, something I've been talking to our leadership about, to be able to pass these bills. And a lot of these bills have companion bills in the Senate or are themselves companion bills. So we have a real chance to get these signed this year. And I think this is important not just because of what the bills do. I think it's also important to give the American public some confidence that Congress is capable of dealing with this issue. And if we can get some bills actually signed into law that make those meaningful first steps, I think we will have demonstrated that.
Well, it's certainly an important issue, and we'll have to leave it there. Obviously, a discussion that will be ongoing. I'd like to thank our guest, California Congressman Jay Obernolte, who chairs the House Task Force on Artificial Intelligence. I'm WTOP Capitol Hill correspondent Mitchell Miller. Thank you for taking part in the Road to Responsible AI, sponsored by Leidos on WTOP.com.